At the break of dawn in ancient Rome, 6 women dressed in white moved silently through a circular temple. Their footsteps echoed softly against marble floors as pale morning light poured through the open roof above. They were known as the purest souls in the empire, virgins chosen by the goddess herself. But when one of them was accused of breaking her sacred vow, the punishment wasn't execution. What came next was far more terrifying. She was sealed alive beneath the earth, given only a loaf of bread and a lamp, and buried while the city above cheered. This is the story of the Vestal Virgins, the most honored, yet the most imprisoned women in history. Their sanctity wasn't a blessing. It was a lifetime sentence that could end in unimaginable horror. Before we descend into that darkness, hit that like button. If you've ever felt trapped by expectations you didn't choose, subscribe, because what happened to these women exposes how power and control can disguise themselves as purity. Now tell me in the comments, would you have accepted such an honor? What you're about to hear isn't myth, it's history, documented in the writings of Cicero, Livy, and Plutarch, confirmed centuries later by archaeological excavations in 1883. For ages, it's been romanticized as divine devotion, when in truth it was systemic imprisonment, polished and presented as holy service. Across the breadth of the Roman Forum, where senators once debated the fate of empires and marble columns reached toward the heavens, stood a temple unlike any other. It was small, circular, and simple, no golden statues, no jeweled treasures. Inside burned a single flame, eternal, sacred, untouchable. Romans believed that if this fire ever died, the city itself would fall, its armies would crumble, its gods would abandon it, and everything Rome had built since the days of Romulus would turn to ash. And so, around that flame moved 6 women whose entire existence was defined by a single command: keep the fire burning, no matter the cost to their own lives. They were the Vestal Virgins, priestesses of Vesta, goddess of the hearth. Their white robes flowed like mist around solemn faces. They walked through the city with a grace that felt almost supernatural. Citizens bowed as they passed. Senators rose when they entered a room. They sat in the front rows at the games. They could pardon a condemned criminal with a single touch. They owned property, wrote wills, and lived in a grand villa, the Atrium Vestae, adorned with fountains and marble mosaics. To outsiders, they seemed like the most privileged women in the empire. But beneath that shimmering image of honor lay a truth much darker. These women weren't chosen, they were taken. Between the ages of 6 and 10, girls from noble families were brought before the Pontifex Maximus, the high priest of Rome. Trembling in white tunics, they stood as priests, studied every detail, face, posture, even the steadiness of their eyes. Physical perfection was mandatory. No scars, no blemishes. When one was chosen, her mother wept, her father bowed, and the child was led away, never to embrace her parents again. She was no longer their daughter. She belonged to the goddess. The ritual that followed seemed gentle, but it marked the death of childhood. Her hair was cut, a lock burned in the sacred flame, and her name erased. She spoke her vow before the gods and the gathered priests. I will remain pure in body and spirit for 30 years. 30 years. 10 years to learn the rituals. 10 years to tend the flame. 10 years to train those who would come after. Only then, if she lived that long, could she leave. Most never did. Freedom, after a lifetime of obedience, felt alien. Every morning before Rome stirred, the Vestals rose to feed the sacred fire. The eldest, called the Virgo Vestalis Maxima, whispered prayers as the flames hissed and crackled. If the fire dies, she would say, Rome dies with it. And it wasn't poetic exaggeration. The people truly believed their empire's fate depended on these women's devotion. The Vestals became living symbols, not of their own humanity, but of Rome's purity. To maintain that illusion, everything that made them human was stripped away. Love, forbidden. Marriage, unthinkable. Desire erased. They were expected to be perfect, divine, untouchable. Not women, but icons. But icons can't bleed. And these women did. Little did they know that the same priests who gave them power could also destroy them. The Pontifex Maximus, the high priest of Rome, watched over every part of a Vestal's life. He alone claimed to hear the will of the goddess. He alone decided whether a Vestal had remained pure. And he alone could choose her fate. To Rome, purity wasn't just a virtue, it was a matter of policy. The empire's victories, its prosperity, even its peace, were said to depend on the chastity of 6 women guarding an eternal flame. When drought came, when plague spread or lightning burned a temple, the blame didn't fall on senators or emperors. It fell on the women who tended the fire. A single rumor could spark hysteria, and if you think that's disturbing, wait until you hear how Rome tested a woman's purity when a Vestal was accused, whether through actual transgression or the whisper of suspicion. She wasn't allowed to defend herself in public. Her judges were the same priests who claimed to speak for the gods. The trials were swift, the verdicts already written. If found guilty, she faced a punishment that spilled no blood, yet promised absolute horror. Because a Vestal was sacred, her blood couldn't be shed. So the priests devised something worse. Just beyond the city walls was a desolate field called the Campus Sceleratus, the field of the wicked. There, workers dug a narrow underground chamber no larger than a tomb. Inside, they placed a couch, an oil lamp, a loaf of bread, and a small jug of milk and water, just enough to pretend mercy. They claimed she wasn't being executed, only left to the will of the gods. On the day of execution, the condemned Vestal was dressed in her ceremonial white robes. Her veil was drawn low. The entire city fell silent as she was led through the streets in what felt like a funeral procession for the living. Some followed out of pity, most followed out of fear. To them, her death meant Rome's sins were being washed away. At the chamber's mouth, the Pontifex Maximus recited prayers. Her hands were bound. She was lowered into the earth. Now picture that moment. The darkness closing in. The scrape of timber sliding into place above her. The muffled sound of dirt raining down. And above, the crowd erupting in cheers, celebrating Rome's purity restored. Below, in that choking blackness, the lamp flickered. Oxygen thinned. The bread remained untouched, the milk undrunk, and the goddess, silent. Hours passed. Maybe days. She would die slowly, entombed alive. While life continued overhead, markets buzzing, soldiers marching, children laughing, unaware that beneath their feet, a woman gasped her final prayers to an unlistening God. What Rome called divine justice was really psychological torture, a ritual designed not to cleanse sin, but to control fear. History remembers Cornelia, the Virgo Vestalis Maxima, the chief Vestal during Emperor Domitian's reign in 83 CE. For 20 years, she served flawlessly. Her devotion was unquestioned. Then calamity struck. Thunder split the Capitoline Hill. Plague spread through the streets. Lightning hit the temple of Jupiter himself. The people panicked. The priests needed someone to blame, and superstition offered its answer. All eyes turned to Cornelia. She was accused of breaking her vow of chastity. There was no witness, no confession, no proof, only an emperor desperate for order and priests eager to please him. The trial was theater disguised as justice. When Cornelia stood before her accusers, her face was pale but defiant. "I am innocent," she said quietly, "and Vesta knows it." But Domitian's eyes were cold. The verdict was already sealed. Guilty. That night, torchlight filled the streets. Cornelia was paraded through crowds who dared not meet her eyes. The procession wound toward the Campus Sceleratus. When she reached the stairway to her grave, she stumbled. A priest reached to steady her. She pulled away, whispering words that history never dared to record. They sealed the chamber, timber, clay, then earth. When it was done, the Pontifex Maximus raised his hands and proclaimed, "Rome is purified." The crowd roared. And somewhere below, Cornelia's lamp burned, until it didn't. But Cornelia's fate wasn't unique. Centuries earlier, a Vestal named Amelia had been condemned when the sacred flame went out during her watch. She swore it was an accident, an act of the gods, not negligence. Her words meant nothing. She too was buried alive. Another Vestal, Licinia, was accused by Cassius, one of Rome's richest men. His true motive? Greed. She owned a villa he coveted. By branding her impure, he could seize it. Public outrage eventually forced him to withdraw. But Licinia lived the rest of her life under suspicion. Her reputation shattered. The pattern was always the same. Misfortune struck Rome. A Vestal was blamed. A woman paid the price. For every failed harvest, every lost war, every omen in the sky, a priestess became the sacrifice. Rome couldn't bear to admit its gods were silent, so it made its women scream instead. Behind the marble walls of Vesta's temple, another kind of silence ruled, the silence of fear. For centuries, these women had been worshipped as divine beings. But beneath the white robes and sacred vows, they were prisoners of a system that called their captivity holiness, ancient. Writers hinted at what they dared not say outright, that the seen priests who guarded these women's virtue also violated their sanctity in the name of testing it. The Pontifex Maximus, the same man who held their lives in his hands, could summon a Vestal into his private chambers. No man outside the priesthood was ever allowed to touch her, except him. And when he claimed it was part of a ritual inspection, no one questioned it. That's how absolute control hides, not in open cruelty, but in sacred disguise. It was a perfect system of domination, obedience wrapped in ritual, exploitation hidden beneath devotion. A smile at a festival, a glance at a soldier, a single misunderstood word, any of it could be twisted into impurity. For a Vestal, suspicion alone could be a death sentence. They lived like birds in a golden cage, worshipped as divine, yet treated as disposable. If this story is already making your blood boil, leave a comment about what you'd say to those priests if you could step back in time. And subscribe, because what happened in that temple shows how power can weaponize purity even today. Time in empires moves strangely. What begins as devotion always ends in decay. By the 4th century CE, Rome had grown vast, fractured and tired. The gods who once ruled every home and battlefield were no longer feared, only remembered. And in the shadow of something new, Christianity, the sacred flame began to flicker. When Emperor Constantine converted, everything changed. The cross replaced the eagle. The Christian god replaced Jupiter and Vesta. The temple still stood, but now it was only a relic, a curiosity for travelers and philosophers. The Atrium Vestae, once filled with the laughter of novices and the prayers of priestesses, began to empty. The fountains dried. The rituals quieted. The offerings grew fewer. Still, the last generation of Vestals refused to abandon the flame. They had given their lives to the goddess. To walk away now would mean admitting that everything, the isolation, the obedience, the fear had been for nothing, but history isn't kind to those who stand against its tide. In 394 CE, Emperor Theodosius issued a decree. All pagan practices were outlawed. Temples were to be closed, sacrifices banned, and the sacred flame of Vesta extinguished forever. The morning it happened, Rome woke under a grey sky. The last 6 Vestals gathered in silence inside their temple. Their robes, once bright as snow, were dulled with age. Their faces lined with devotion. No crowd came to watch. No priest recited rites. Only the distant echo of church bells rolled across the city that had forgotten them. One by one, they stepped forward. They knelt before the altar, the same altar that had outlived kings, emperors, and gods. Their hands trembled as they poured the final oil, whispering the final prayers. The flame flickered weakly, then died, and with it something far greater vanished. Not just a ritual, but Rome itself, as it had known itself to be. For centuries, Romans believed that if the flame went out, the empire would fall. And in a way, they were right. That moment marked the end, not of a fire, but of a civilization's soul. The temple was sealed. The atrium Vestae fell into ruin. The names of the last priestesses were never recorded. Their graves, if they had any, were lost to time. In 1883, archaeologist Rodolfo Lanciani unearthed the ruins of the atrium Vestae. Beneath layers of earth and shattered marble, his team found fragments, broken statues, oil lamps, and bits of jewelry. But what haunted them most weren't the relics. It was the footprints, worn stone thresholds, smooth from countless bare feet, marks where women had walked for centuries in silence. The air still carried an eerie stillness, as if time itself refused to move on. Among the ruins, they found inscribed plaques honoring names long forgotten: Flavia Publicia, Quilia, Claudiana, Terentia Flavola. Women who had lived, served, and died in devotion to a flame that no longer existed. Modern historians now understand what Rome never admitted. The Vestal Virgins were never guardians of purity. They were symbols of control. By policing their bodies, Rome symbolically ruled its destiny. They weren't protecting the city from sin. They were protecting the illusion of divine order. The tragedy wasn't only in their deaths, but in their lives. They were forced to embody a purity no human could maintain, performing perfection for a world that demanded it, and punished them when they faltered. Every smile was measured, every breath a prayer, every mistake a potential grave, and when they stumbled, the same men who called them sacred became their executioners. History teaches us something here, Johnny, something that still matters. Beneath every empire's greatness lies the quiet suffering of those silenced to preserve its illusion. Purity, when enforced by power, isn't holiness. It's cruelty wearing a halo. Even in the darkest corners of history, truth endures longer than any empire. A single vow of chastity became a lifetime of imprisonment. A whisper of impurity became a death sentence. 6 women guarded a flame that symbolized Rome's power, while Rome consumed them. If this story left you shaken, subscribe for more hidden histories that reveal the cost of power. And remember, history's darkest secrets are often hidden in plain sight, dressed in white robes and called sacred.